Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the silent triplets of Appalachia and the ancient evil they awakened that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. Three small coffins, stark and raw against the landscape, lay side by side in the biting morning frost. They were crude containers, hastily built from rough-hewn pine wood, symbols of a tragedy that had befallen a family. But the girls who were meant to be inside them, the girls for whom they were built, were not dead. From within the sealed boxes came a sound that defied all reason, a noise that would forever haunt the memories of those who heard it. It was a faint but insistent scratching of fingernails against wood, a desperate, living rhythm emanating from the very heart of death's effigy. This was no random settling of a structure. It was the determined work of trapped, living things. High on the hill, the Ashborne cabin stood silent, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney, the familiar scent of burning oak, a comforting aroma of mountain life and warmth, drifted down through the hollow. Yet, it was tainted by something else, an underlying odor that was fundamentally wrong. It was a scent both metallic and cloyingly sweet, the smell of a secret that had begun to decay. This is the story of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashborne triplets, born into the unforgiving mountains of West Virginia in 1836. It is a story defined not by what they said, but by what they did not. Their profound silence would ultimately speak louder and more terribly than any scream ever could. To understand the horror that would methodically dismantle the isolated settlement of Bramble Hollow, one must first understand the land that shaped it. One must appreciate the oppressive quiet of the mountains themselves. A place where secrets were a form of currency and silence was a shield against a world that did not care to listen. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a crucible of hardship and mystery, a world unto themselves. In the mid-19th century, they were a labyrinth of deep hollows and jagged ridges, so profoundly isolated that communities could live and die for generations without ever seeing a government map, a census taker, or a circuit judge. The mountains were a cage of green and stone, where the sun would appear late and vanish early, plunging the hollows into long premature twilights. Here, in these shadowed valleys, bloodlines tangle like the dense mountain laurel that choked the forests, their roots digging deep into the same soil for a century or more. Justice was not a concept found in books. It answered not to a distant courthouse, but to an unwritten, unyielding code carved from generations of fear, stubborn tradition, and absolute self-reliance. To survive here meant knowing when to speak, and more importantly, when to hold your tongue. Bramble Hollow was a perfect embodiment of this existence. It was less a town and more a scattering of souls, perhaps 40 in total, their log cabins clinging to the mountainside. They were connected by little more than worn deer paths and a shared, unspoken understanding that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge, that some evils were better left undisturbed. Looking away was a skill, a vital part of the social grammar. The Ashborne family lived at the settlement's geographic and social heart. Their sturdy cabin, built by a grandfather whose bones were already part of the mountain, had sheltered 3 generations of folk who minded their own business. They expected, with a quiet but unwavering intensity, that others do the same. Mortimer Ashbourne was a man made of the same grit as the land he worked, coaxing corn and beans from a stubborn hillside that seemed to yield more rock than earth. His wife, Helena, born a Bramblecroft, came from good, strong mountain stock. She was a woman who could birth a calf in a storm, cure a ham with an expert hand, and sing the old haunting ballads that were said to keep the more malevolent mountain spirits at bay. Their lives were a testament to this Appalachian spirit, hard, practical, and deeply intertwined with the harsh rhythms of the land they called home. But local memory, fragmented as it is, hints at a darker lineage within the Bramblecroft line. There were whispers about Helena's grandmother, a woman who understood the mountain's oldest secrets, who could read the signs in the flight of a raven or the taste of the well water. These stories spoke of warnings passed down from the Cherokee, who had abandoned these specific mountains decades earlier. They left not because of settlers, but because of something they called Woonol the Ancient. Insatiable hunger that slept in the deep places beneath the stones. Into this world of quiet tradition and buried fears, Helena Ashbourne was set to bring new life. The winter of 1836 was a brutal one, a season of deep snows and winds that carried the sound of wolves down from the high ridges. The midwife, a hardened and widely respected woman named Marcella Wesley, made her arduous journey through the blizzard, climbing through drifts that reached her knees to attend the birth. Based on the size of Helena's belly and the accumulated wisdom of her 40 years of practice, she expected one child. After examining her further, she considered the possibility of 2, if the Lord saw fit to bless the hard-working Ashbournes with twins, in a community where every pair of hands was a blessing. Twins were a sign of great fortune. Nobody, not even in their wildest superstitions, expected 3. The triplets arrived during the longest night of the year, a time steeped in folklore when the veil between worlds was said to be at its thinnest. The mountain wind howled with a predatory, almost sentient hunger, and the cabin's single glass window rattled violently in its frame, as if trying to flee. The fire in the hearth seemed to shrink, its light struggling against the oppressive darkness that pressed in from all sides. Hours later, in the quiet confidence of her own home, her hands still trembling as she recounted the birth to her husband, Marcella would confess the detail that chilled her more than the memory of the winter wind. In all her years, she had delivered hundreds of babies, every single one, healthy or frail, had entered the world with a cry, a gasp for air, a vocal declaration of its arrival. It was the sound of life itself. But not these 3. Not one of them made a sound. Essie came first, then Bessie, then Dessie. 3 identical girls, each with a shock of impossibly dark hair and even darker eyes. They didn't cry. They didn't blink. They simply stared at the flickering lamplight with a profound and unsettling intensity, an unnerving awareness that made the grown men who later saw them deeply uncomfortable. It was a gaze that did not seem to be seeing the world, but assessing it. They watch everything, Marcella whispered to her husband, her voice strained with a fear she could not name. Like they are not newborns, but old souls peering out through new eyes, like they're taking notes on us all. On the left shoulder of each infant, she found the same peculiar birthmark, a detail she would document in her personal records. It was 3 small, perfectly formed, interlocking circles, a symbol that seemed less a random quirk of pigmentation and more an ancient, inscribed sigil of ownership. Their growth did nothing to soothe the community's nascent unease. It only deepened it. The girls developed with a malevolent synchronicity, a perfect choreographed progression that defied the beautiful chaos of a normal childhood. They reached every developmental milestone on the exact same day. They cut their first teeth in the same hour. They spoke their first words, a single, shared noun in a chilling, dispassionate unison. When they learned to walk, they took their first steps together, as if guided by some invisible, shared force. But while most mountain homes were filled with the joyful noise of children's babble and laughter, the Ashborne cabin was draped in an ever-thickening, eerie quiet. It was a silence that settled over the property like a graveyard fog, cold and heavy. The triplets communicated not with words, but with the complex language of shared glances and subtle, imperceptible gestures, completing each other's thoughts before they could even be formed into sentences. This unnatural, unbreakable bond excluded everyone, including their own parents, who soon began to look like strangers in their own home. And the neighbors began to notice. Phineas Colebrook, a pragmatic farmer whose property bordered the Ashbourne land, mentioned to his wife that he had seen the 3 girls standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods for hours, simply watching him work his fields. Their expressions, he admitted over the supper table, were disturbingly vacant yet intensely focused. Far too old for their young faces, made my skin crawl, he confessed. A rare admission of fear from a man who had faced down panthers and winter starvation, like they were studying me, sizing me up for some purpose I wouldn't care to know. When the triplets turned 7, the settlement's traveling preacher, the formidable Josiah Thornvale, arrived for his monthly visit. He found the children sitting in the front pew of the makeshift church, their hands folded neatly in their laps, their dark eyes fixed upon him. Such apparent piety would have pleased him in any other children, but their intensity made his prepared sermon feel hollow and catch in his throat. According to a detailed entry in the preacher's personal ledger, dated October 1843, he pulled Mortimer Ashbourne aside after the service. He was visibly shaken, mopping sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "Those girls of yours, Mortimer," Thornvale said, his voice low and urgent, "they have not blinked once in the past hour." Mortimer simply shrugged, a gesture of weary resignation that mountain men perfected when pressed on private family matters. "They're just quiet children, preacher," he replied, his gaze avoiding the other man's. "Ain't no law against that." But the people of Bramble Hollow were beginning to sense that while there may have been no man-made law against such a profound quiet, there was something deeply, terribly against the laws of nature. It was a silence that was listening, a quiet that was waiting, and soon the entire hollow would learn that some silences are merely the drawing of a breath before the final scream. And so The years continued their slow, inexorable march. The quiet of the Ashborne triplets deepened, evolving from a childhood peculiarity into something more deliberate, more purposeful. The community, in its self-preserving wisdom, had learned to look away, but the mountain itself could not. The very land began to register the presence of the sisters as a blight, a slow-acting poison seeping into the soil. The first tangible signs of this corruption were small, easily dismissed things, the kind of misfortunes that were common in the hard life of the hollow. Chickens began to disappear from coops, not taken by foxes that left a telltale spray of feathers, but simply vanishing in the night. Then, larger livestock, a prized hog, a young calf gone without a trace, leaving behind only the unnerving silence where life used to be. The hunting dogs of Bramble Hollow, animals of fierce courage, would whine and refuse to approach the Ashbourne property line. The hair on their backs raised as if facing a predator they could smell but not see. More disturbing were the effects on the community's children. Those who played too near the edge of the Ashbourne woods would often return home with sudden, inexplicable fevers. These were not the common mountain agues that lingered for weeks. They were violent, consuming illnesses that burned hot for a single night and then broke as quickly as they had come. But they left the young ones changed. They returned to their families more cautious, more withdrawn, their eyes holding a shadow of something they couldn't quite remember, as if they'd learned a hard lesson in a dream they were forbidden to recall. The triplets themselves, however, seemed untouched by any of childhood's typical afflictions. They never caught the fevers that swept through the hollow every few years. They never scraped their knees or caught their fingers indoors. In a world of constant, grinding hardship, they moved with an unnatural grace, pristine and unharmed. Historical accounts note that they never seemed to feel the cold. Even when a bitter frost painted the cabin windows and other children huddled close to the fire for warmth, they were observers of hardship, not participants. By the time they reached their 15th year, the silence that surrounded them had evolved. It was no longer a passive absence of sound, but an active, oppressive force. The girls had grown tall and lean, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. They dressed identically, spoke in unison on the rare occasions they spoke at all, and shared a silent knowledge that excluded everyone else in the settlement, including their own parents. The weight of this shared secret bore down heavily on Helena and Mortimer Ashbourne. Helena aged rapidly during those years, her hair turning a brittle gray, her hands developing a tremor that she tried to hide during Sunday services. She had tried for more children after the triplets, a desperate attempt to bring normalcy and noise back into her home. But she miscarried 3 times in succession, each loss leaving her more hollow-eyed and withdrawn, as if the presence in her home would not tolerate any rivals for her life force. Mortimer, a man once known for his quiet strength, took to drinking corn whiskey in quantities that deeply concerned his neighbors, though none dared to comment directly. He was a man seeking an oblivion that was never deep enough to erase the sight of his own daughters watching him from the shadows of his own home. The land itself seemed to mirror the family's decay. Gardens planted near the Ashbourne property produced stunted, misshapen vegetables that tasted faintly of ash. Wells that had run clear for generations began yielding water with a strange, metallic tang that made livestock refuse to drink. The old-timers, in hushed conversations by their firesides, began to mutter about curses and restless mountain spirits. But these were modern times, the year 1853, and such talk was dismissed as belonging to their grandparents' generation. Surely, they reasoned, 3 quiet girls couldn't be responsible for the Hollow's growing unease, could they? The answer would come with the turning of the season. It began on the morning of October 15th, 1853, just 3 weeks after the Ashborne triplets had celebrated their 17th birthday in their characteristic unnerving silence. That morning, Phineas Colebrook found his prize Hereford bull, a massive beast named Caesar, dead in the center of his pasture. The cause of death was not immediately apparent. There were no signs of a struggle, no churned earth, no tracks from wolves or a panther. As Phineas drew closer, the frost crunching under his boots, a cold dread settled in his stomach. The bull's throat had been opened in a perfect, clean line, a wound so precise it looked as if it had been drawn with a surgeon's scalpel. But it was the absence of blood that stopped his heart. It had been drained completely. So thoroughly had the life force been taken from the animal that the grass beneath the massive carcass remained pristine and green, untouched by a single drop of crimson. The only evidence was the faint, cloying scent of copper pennies hanging in the dawn air. "This ain't the work of wildcats," Phineas told his neighbor later that day, his voice a low growl of disbelief and rage. "This is butcher's work, but mountain butchers leave tracks, and mountain butchers take the meat. Whatever had killed Caesar had taken nothing but its blood, leaving nearly 800 pounds of prime beef to rot in the weak autumn sun." The discovery sent a tremor of profound unease through the settlement. Livestock meant survival in Bramble Hollow, where the winter could stretch from November through April. A relentless siege of snow and ice. Losing an animal to predators was a known, accepted part of mountain life. But this felt different. It was deliberate, wasteful, and almost ceremonial in its cold precision. The incident dredged up memories that people had tried to forget. Marcella Wesley, the midwife, found herself remembering the strange, interlocking circles on the newborn's shoulders. She recalled a detail she had never spoken of, the fact that Helena Ashborne had bled far less during the triple birth than most women bled delivering a single child. "Blood calls to blood," her grandmother had always said, a phrase that now seemed less like folklore and more like a dire prophecy. 2 days after Caesar's death, the widow Morrison, a stern woman who had raised 8 children and buried 2 husbands, made a gruesome discovery in her own yard. Her entire flock of chickens was found arranged in a perfect, deliberate circle. Each bird was physically intact, without a single feather out of place. But they were drained of life, their eyes clouded over white as winter frost. That very afternoon, the widow packed her essential belongings, abandoned her home of 40 years, and moved in with a sister down in the valley. Something stirring in these mountains, she told anyone who would listen, her voice trembling. Something that's been sleeping for too long. The Ashborne triplets attended the impromptu burial. Phineas gave his bull before the meat spoiled completely. They stood at the edge of the small gathering, identical in their dark dresses and darker stares, watching as Phineas and 2 other men struggled to drag the massive carcass into a hastily dug pit. And it was then that Josiah Thornvale, the preacher, saw it. Just for a moment, Essie smiled. It was a slight, almost imperceptible upturn of her lips that held no warmth, no humor. It held only a deep and chilling satisfaction that made the preacher's skin crawl. When he blinked and looked again, the expression had vanished. leaving only the familiar blank stare that had unsettled him for years. The true horror, however, had yet to reveal itself. It would arrive not in the form of a dead animal, but in the vacant eyes of a child. On October 28th, Dr. Edmund Fairfax, a man of science who traveled the mountain circuit, was summoned to the Colebrook farm. He was a rationalist, a man who believed in logical explanations for the ailments of the body and mind. He had been documenting the growing anxiety in Bramble Hollow as a classic case of mass hysteria, common in isolated communities under stress. But what he was about to see would shatter his clinical detachment forever. He was called to examine Martha Colebrook, Phineas's youngest daughter. The 12-year-old girl had been missing for 2 days. A frantic search had yielded nothing. Then, that morning, her father had found her in the family's barn, standing motionless among the cattle, her eyes rolled back in her head until only the whites showed. She was unharmed, but she was not there. Martha couldn't remember where she had been or how she had returned to the barn. She spoke only in disconnected fragments, whispering about the sisters and the teaching, and about learning to be quiet like them. But the most disturbing discovery came when her mother was changing her out of her soiled clothes. On her left shoulder were 3 small fresh marks, marks that looked suspiciously like the birthmarks the Ashborne triplets had carried since birth. Doctor Fairfax examined the marks with a magnifying glass borrowed from Josiah Thornvale's reading kit. Under magnification, what appeared at first to be simple bruising revealed itself as something far more deliberate, far more sinister. 3 interlocking circles had been carved into the child's flesh with an impossible surgical precision. The wounds were not deep, but they were already beginning to heal in a pattern that would leave permanent, intricate scars. In a letter he later wrote to a colleague in Charleston, the doctor's steady, scientific hand trembled. "These marks," he wrote, "appear to have been made with an intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The depth and placement suggest a level of skill that borders on medical training, or at a minimum, extensive practice on living subjects." The terrible truth finally crashed down upon the community with the weight of a landslide. Martha Colebrook had been marked. She had been claimed. Inducted into a silent covenant the adults couldn't understand but could now feel in their bones. The triplets were not just killing livestock. They were not just spreading fear. They were building something. They were harvesting the children. And as the first snows of November began to dust the ridgelines, the remaining families of Bramble Hollow were forced to confront a terrifying question: if one child could be taken, taught, and changed so completely, how many more would follow? And what would happen when their army was finally complete? And so, November brought an early, suffocating snow that year, blanketing the hollow in a white so pure and absolute it made the dark. Vacant windows of abandoned cabins looked like the hollow eye sockets of a skull. 3 more families, their faces etched with a silent, hurried panic, had packed their meager belongings and headed down to the valley settlements. They claimed business elsewhere, urgent matters with distant kin. But they left behind livestock, furniture, and decades of mountain roots. Those who remained did so either from a stubborn pride that was the bedrock of their existence, or because they understood a truth the departed did not. Running wouldn't help when the danger already lived inside their children's dreams. Dr. Fairfax had established a makeshift clinic in the settlement's 1-room schoolhouse, a place where childish laughter had once echoed. Now, it was a repository of silent fear. In his official reports to his mentor at Johns Hopkins, he could only describe the affliction in cold, clinical terms collective nervous exhaustion with unexplained physical manifestations. But the evidence before his eyes defied such sterile language. 7 children in the hollow now bore the 3 interlocking circles on their left shoulders. Each marking had appeared under different, yet chillingly similar, circumstances. The pattern was now irrefutable. A grim, repeating nightmare. A child would vanish for a day or two, swallowed by the woods, only to return with no memory of their absence. They would come back exhibiting a new, profound quiet that echoed the Ashborne triplets' unsettling stillness. They were home, but they were no longer present, from a medical standpoint. Doctor, Fairfax wrote, his pen scratching furiously across the page. I am observing what appears to be induced catatonia in minors, accompanied by deliberate scarification using techniques that suggest an anatomical knowledge far beyond what one would expect in this rural population. What the doctor couldn't bring himself to document, what his scientific mind refused to fully process, was how the marked children had begun gathering at the edge of the woods each evening. They would stand there, motionless in the falling snow, until their frantic parents dragged them home. He could not explain how they had started moving in perfect synchronization when they thought no one was watching, like dancers following a silent, unheard music. The marks were spreading, a contagion of the soul. On November 8th, the plague struck the heart of the community's faith. 10-year-old Samuel Thornvale, the preacher's own grandson, disappeared while collecting firewood just behind his family's cabin. His grandmother found him 2 days later, sitting ramrod straight in the very church pew where the Ashborne triplets usually sat. 3 fresh, weeping wounds were already beginning to heal on his shoulder. His young face, once full of life and mischief, now bore an expression of cold, adult calculation that made her fall to her knees and weep. 5 days later, on November 13th, it claimed the future. 8-year-old Rebecca Wesley, Marcella's granddaughter, vanished from her own bed in the dead of night. Her grandmother, the woman who had brought nearly every person in the hollow into the world, searched for 36 agonizing hours. She finally discovered the child standing waist deep in the freezing creek that ran behind the Ashborne property. Her thin nightgown was frozen solid to her skin, but her body, impossibly, was warm to the touch. The 3 interlocking circles were already there, already healing, already binding her to whatever dark covenant the triplets were building. Each disappearance followed the same terrifying script. Each return brought the same hollow changes. Each new marking added another silent voice to the chorus that had begun gathering at the settlement's edges, watching, waiting, learning. Phineas Colebrook organized the first official community meeting on the evening of November 16th, gathering the remaining families in the cold schoolhouse after Dr. Fairfax had finished his evening rounds. 23 adults crowded into a space meant for half that number, their breath fogging the unheated air, the oil lamps casting long, dancing shadows on walls lined with children's innocent drawings, scenes of mountain life that now seemed to mock the darkness pressing in from all sides. "We know what's happening," Phineas said, his voice raw, dispensing with any preamble. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Josiah Thornvale stood slowly, his old preacher's training warring with the fresh terror of a grandfather. "My Samuel, he won't speak to me anymore," he confessed, his voice cracking. "He won't even look at me. He just sits at the supper table like he's listening to voices I can't hear. That ain't my grandson in my house anymore. That's something wearing his face." Murmurs of pained agreement rippled through the gathering. Other parents shared similar, heartbreaking observations, children who no longer played, who no longer laughed, who watched their own families with the detailed, analytical interest of scientists studying specimens. The marked children still responded to direct commands. They still ate when fed and slept in their own beds. But the essential spark that made them them, the light of their individual souls, seemed to have been dimmed and redirected toward a purpose their parents couldn't begin to fathom. A desperate suggestion was made to leave, to abandon their homes and start fresh somewhere else. But Phineas's reply cut through the hope like a scythe. "And go where?" he asked, his voice heavy with grim certainty. "You think whatever has claimed our children won't follow you, think distance matters to something that can reach into their dreams." The final confrontation was not a choice. It was an inevitability. On November 24th, his patience and his faith in reasonable solutions utterly exhausted, Phineas Colebrook strapped on his father's old Navy Colt revolver. He walked out into the snow that had been falling continuously for 3 days and turned his face toward the Ashborne cabin. Behind him, 6 other men followed, the last remnants of the community's fighting spirit. They were armed with rifles, revolvers, and a cold determination born from absolute desperation. This would end tonight, one way or another. Through the frosted windows of the cabin, they could see the triplets seated around their kitchen table, hands folded, as motionless and serene as carved statues. They did not acknowledge the armed men surrounding their home. They did not even blink. Mortimer Ashborne met the group at his front door. His face was a gaunt mask of exhaustion and something deeper, something akin to surrender, a final, broken recognition that his daughters had moved far beyond his ability to understand, let alone control. "Phineas," he said quietly, his voice a mere whisper, "you know I can't let you hurt them." "Are they still your children?" "Mortimer," Phineas replied, his hand resting on the cold steel of his pistol grip. "Because the children I knew didn't steal other people's young ones and turn them into walking ghosts." The confrontation that followed would be seared into the memories of the few who survived to recount it. Helena Ashborne emerged from the cabin's dark interior, moving with the unsteady gait of someone who had found solace in laudanum's numbing embrace. Behind her came the triplets, dressed identically in dark wool coats, their expressions as placid and untroubled as Sunday morning churchgoers. "Good evening, Mr. Colebrook," Essie said, her voice carrying with an unnatural clarity in the cold, still air. It was the first time most of the men had heard any of the triplets speak in years. "We've been expecting you." "Then you know why we're here." Phineas tightened his grip on his weapon. "You're here because you have lost something," Bessie continued, her words flowing seamlessly from her sisters. A single thought spoken by 2 mouths. "And you think taking us will bring it back. But what you have lost cannot be returned," Bessie finished, her smile containing no warmth, only the serene recognition of a game played to its inevitable, foregone conclusion. Because it was never truly yours to begin with. The men raised their weapons, their fingers tightening on the triggers. But something in the triplets synchronized. Calm response made them hesitate, and in that moment of hesitation, they were lost. The girls began to hum. It was that same strange, otherworldly melody that had drifted through the hollow for months. But now it was different. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the cabin walls, from the snow-laden trees, from the very air they were breathing. "Doctor," Fairfax, who had joined the group despite his medical training's emphasis on healing rather than harm, felt his rifle grow impossibly heavy in his hands. The humming wasn't just sound, it was a weapon, something that bypassed the ears and worked directly on the nervous system, creating a creeping paralysis that spread from his fingertips to his shoulders, to the very muscles that controlled his breathing. "The thing about children," Essie said, stepping closer to the frozen, helpless men, "is that they trust so completely. They follow where they are led." "Adults are more difficult," Bessie added, circling to the left like a predator testing its prey. "Adults question. Adults resist. But in the end," Dessie concluded, moving to complete the triangle around the paralyzed men, "everyone learns to be quiet." The humming intensified, and Phineas Colebrook, a veteran of 2 wars, a survivor of mountain winters that had killed stronger men, felt hot tears streaming down his frozen cheeks. His own grandson, Thomas, had stepped from the tree line and was now walking calmly toward the cabin. The boy moved with the same eerie, fluid grace as the triplets, his young face empty of recognition, empty of love, empty of everything that had once made him human. The battle had been lost, not with weapons, but with will. Dawn broke gray and lifeless over Bramble Hollow on November 25th. The 7 men were found kneeling in a perfect semicircle in the snow before the Ashborne cabin. Their weapons had been cast aside. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected the same vacant, hollow stare that now marked their own children. They were not dead. They had been conquered. Dr. Fairfax's final journal entry, written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic and almost illegible, recorded the event with a chilling clinical precision, even as his own sanity frayed and then snapped. "The subjects," he wrote, "demonstrate an ability to induce temporary cataleptic states through auditory stimulation. The mechanism remains unclear, but the results are undeniable." It was the last coherent thought he would ever record. There would be no trial for the Ashborne triplets, no judge, no jury. There would be no legal repercussions, for their crime was beyond the scope of human law. What statute could be applied to a crime that stole the soul but left the body intact? What sentence could be passed on beings who could turn a community's staunchest defenders into another set of marked, silent followers? The social fabric of Bramble Hollow had not just been torn, it had been unraveled completely. The settlement now belonged to Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashborne. Their dominion was absolute, and their 18th birthday, still 5 days away, would now mark not just their legal independence, but their full and terrible flowering into something the mountains had never seen before. What happens when 3 sisters, who have spent 18 years learning to command silence, finally decide to break it? The answer would come with the December moon, when they would speak their true names aloud for the very first time. And so, the children stopped coming home in late November. Their parents, hollow shells of grief, could only watch as they stood in unnerving formations at the tree line. Small figures arranged like chess pieces waiting for a game to begin. The synchronized breathing of the marked children created a low hum that seemed to match the mountain's own heartbeat. A sound carried on a breeze scented with pine and something sharp and metallic. The battle for Bramble Hollow's soul was no longer a private struggle. It was a war between the few who would still act and the many who had already lost. The 21 marked children had taken up residence in the abandoned schoolhouse, sleeping in precise rows on the coal floor. They shared strange meals that appeared from unknown sources. spending their days in a collective stillness that turned the small building into a dark monastery. Doctor. Fairfax's equipment lay forgotten. His final coherent journal entry, a chilling testament. The subjects have evolved beyond my ability to study them. I now fear that I am the subject being studied. Phineas Colebrook and the other men from the doomed confrontation now served as a silent honor guard at the Ashborne cabin, motionless regardless of the brutal weather. Their families had stopped trying to reach them, a heartbreaking understanding passing between them. The bodies remained, but the souls within had been conscripted into something larger than individual will. Only 5 adults remained untouched in Bramble Hollow. There was Marcella Wesley, her age a seeming shield, Josiah Thornvale, his faith cracked but not extinguished, Mary Colebrook, fueled by raw maternal fury, and Helena's sister, Ruth Bramblecroft, who had just arrived from the next hollow with the requested family heirloom. The 5th was a traveling merchant, Silas Kane, who had the misfortune of arriving just as the settlement's transformation reached its crescendo. They gathered in secret on the night of December 2nd, the eve of the triplets' 18th birthday, finding a fragile sanctuary in the abandoned church. "Tomorrow," Marcella said, her voice a raspy whisper. "Something final is going to happen. I feel it in my bones." Ruth Bramblecroft nodded, her resemblance to Helena making her presence ghostly. "The girls asked me to bring a book from our grandmother's things." She trembled. "It's written in a language I don't recognize, with pictures, instructions, diagrams, and symbols that match the marks on the children." All eyes turned to Silas Kane, the weathered merchant. He shifted uncomfortably. "Not exactly this," he said carefully, "but similar. I've seen places where the children went quiet first, where adults stopped making their own decisions. Let's just say I learned to recognize the signs and avoid any community that showed them." The church grew colder as his words sank in. Outside, through the frosted windows, they could see lights burning brightly in every window of the Ashborne cabin. The celebration had already begun. At 11:47 p.m., the church bell began to toll on its own 13 strikes. A chilling pause, then 13 more. A countdown. Marcella clutched the ancient book, peering through the window. The entire marked population swayed in concentric circles around the cabin, humming a wordless, soul-scraping melody. "Look at their shadows," Josiah whispered, "in the stark moonlight." Each person cast not one, but 3 writhing silhouettes that moved independently, reaching like grasping fingers toward the cabin. Ruth frantically turned the pages of the book. "It's not just their minds," she read, translating the Latin text. "The shadows are vessels, containers. Something has been living in their shadows, growing stronger with each person marked." The truth settled over them like grave dirt. The triplets had been harvesting souls. At exactly midnight, the bell fell silent. A new voice emerged, belonging to all 3 triplets at once, harmonized into something that made the church walls creak. The true names were being spoken. The cabin door opened, and the triplets emerged in luminous white dresses, each carrying a strangely curved knife. Their features shifted and reformed into an inhuman perfection that hurt to look at, their eyes glowing with a silver, depthless light. "They're not human anymore," Josiah whispered, his faith shattering. "They never were. They were just incubating. The three figures raised their knives to the moon, and every shadow in the settlement tore itself from its owner, flowing across the snow like black oil. The marked people collapsed as their life force drained away. A scream started then, not from human throats, but from the shadows themselves as they converged on the figures that had once been the Ashborne Triplets, where the girls had stood. Three towering, terrible, and beautiful figures now commanded the settlement, their bodies contorting into forms that followed no earthly anatomy. "They're not sisters," Ruth whispered in horrified realization. "They're aspects, three parts of a single being." The triple birth had been a summoning. Silas Kane grabbed Mary Colebrook as the entity that had worn Essie's face fixed its gaze on the church. The five survivors felt their minds laid bare, their memories rifled through. A voice of pure thought entered their heads. "You witnessed the awakening. This makes you valuable or dangerous. The choice is yours." The voice showed them visions other settlements harvested, other communities seasoned with fear by the stories of the few allowed to survive. The entities didn't just feed on life, they fed on the terror their reputation generated. "They're going to let us live," Mary Colebrook said, her voice flat with a grief beyond tears. "Not out of mercy, but because our stories will make the next settlement easier to claim." As dawn approached, a final command came. "You will leave. You will tell what you have seen. You will prepare the next harvest. Refusal is not an option." It was a choice that was no choice at all. Dawn came gray and lifeless over Bramble Hollow, revealing a landscape of bone-dust snow and stark leafless trees. 27 empty shells lay scattered around a cabin that seemed to exist out of phase with reality. The transformed entities were gone, but their presence lingered, a resonance that made every step feel like walking on the bones of the dead. In the pitiless light of December 4th, 1853, the five survivors made their decision. They would carry the warning, volunteering for a lifetime of damnation to offer others a sliver of hope. Over the following decades, they scattered across the eastern mountains, becoming a secret network of watchers. Marcella watched newborns for unnatural signs. Mary passed coded warnings through quilting circles about the silent children. Josiah traveled as a wild-eyed prophet preaching of a different kind of evil. Silas carried warnings with his wares, and Ruth became the keeper of the ancient book, distributing fragments of its knowledge. Their efforts created a loose network that prevented at least 7 known harvests, communities that fled at the first word of the Silent Sisters. But they couldn't save everyone. The entities adapted, and the cycle continued. Bramble Hollow was abandoned for nearly 70 years, a silent monument. The state eventually claimed the land for a forestry preserve. But even today, rangers and hikers report anomalies in that section of the mountains, places where compasses spin, cameras malfunction, and the silence feels too deep, too complete. The entities that wore the faces of the triplets have never been seen again, though reports still surface of communities that empty overnight, leaving behind only confused authorities and stories that never make sense in official reports. The survivors of Bramble Hollow learned the hardest choice isn't between good and evil, but between a comfortable lie and a truth that demands action, between the safety of ignorance and the burden of bearing witness. Believing was never the point. Watching, recognizing, and acting when action might still matter. These were the tools they passed down. It is a question that, even now, echoes down from those silent, watchful mountains.